What if I told you that God could have led Israel into the Promised Land in 11 days, but instead, He shepherded them through 40 years of sand, sky, and testing? That contrast, 11 days versus 40 years, sits at the heart of everything that follows. It is not a mere historical oddity. It is a question that stares at the way we live, the way we trust, and the way God shapes a people to inherit a promise. Think of it. Deuteronomy records a straight-line distance from Sinai to the Jordan that could have been walked in 11 days. 11 days. A family could pack up, set out, and be standing on the banks of the Jordan in less time than a single modern vacation. Yet God chose a different road. He led a nation out of the iron grip of Egypt with signs and wonders that left the world in awe, and then He set up a lifelong classroom in the wilderness. Why would the God who split seas and brought plagues of judgment posture His people into years of wandering? Start at the beginning. For 400 years the people of Israel had known only the rhythm of servitude. Identity in Egypt was shaped by other people's definitions. Names given by taskmasters, futures assigned by the whip, worth measured by productivity. Slavery did more than bend backs. It rewired belief. It taught the soul that power meant survival was found in being useful to someone else's plan, not in being a child of the living God. When God finally answered their cries, the miracle was spectacular. Plagues, Passover blood on the lintel, the final night of release. They left with silver and with songs, yet the moment freedom arrived, the memory scars of bondage were still active. Freedom did not automatically rewrite identity. Crossing the Red Sea was the story's hinge. Picture the shore, a curtain of water held back, a pathway with walls of sea on either side, thousands walking through a dry corridor while Egypt's chariots thundered where their feet had been only hours before. The sea closed and the past was buried. That moment was not merely rescue, it was a severing. God built a wall between them and their old life. He removed the road of retreat. But language alone cannot explain the mystery. Even with the sea behind them and the mountain ahead, Israel's heart continued to walk back in imagination to the life they had known. The miracle locked the past away externally. Internally, the past persisted. Not long after the Red Sea, the people met bitter water at a place called Marah. They tasted the aftertaste of deliverance and found it tinged with bitterness. Their response? Complaint. God's response? He showed them a tree and the water became sweet. Then they faced hunger and fear, and God rained from heaven a strange bread, manna each morning, a deliberate, undramatic miracle. It came day by day, not as a single ordained windfall that would annihilate dependence, but as a slow regimen. You could gather as much as you needed for the day, no more. When some tried to hoard, the provision spoiled. The command was clear: eat today, trust tomorrow, with tomorrow's bread. Deuteronomy later reflects on this pattern as formative. God humbled them and tested them, that He might know what was in their hearts and that He might keep them dependent on Him. Deuteronomy 8. The manna was more than food, it was a training device. Here is a truth worth saying plainly. Miracles do not always change the heart. Demonstrations of power can free a people from a physical prison while leaving the chains of identity intact. That is the unsettling thesis. Evidence will not automatically birth faith. Israel saw plagues that humbled Pharaoh, saw waters stand like walls, witnessed guidance from a pillar of cloud and fire, and yet, in the shadow of Sinai, they made a golden calf. If seeing were sufficient, idolatry would have been impossible. The calf shouts that wonder and obedience are not the same thing. The heart remains stubborn, and God's curriculum often targets the will and the identity beneath the surface. This is where "the desert was necessary" moves from being a sermon slogan to a pastoral reality. The wilderness was not merely punishment. That would be a one-dimensional reading. It was formation, a prolonged, stubborn re-education. Think of a child who has learned to survive by walking on the edge of a cliff because someone once stood there and tossed a rope. Mercy removes the immediate threat. Formation teaches a different gait. The desert held the people while God rewired their assumptions about who He was and who they were. The scenes of the next days are cinematic and ordinary at the same time. Dawn light reveals a thin layer of white on the sand, small, like coriander seed, and the children of Israel gather it, grinding and baking and making cakes. The cloud moves, the camp breaks, the fire appears at night, and the cloud returns by day. Sand does not wear their sandals out, their clothes do not fray. The logistical miracles are constant but modest in scale. They form a rhythm, a discipline of dependence. Every morning there is again enough. Every night the cloud reassures. We must notice the domestic quality of these wonders. God focused not on spectacular, once-off transformations, but on the daily practices that shape a people over time. This is theological training in the small things. And yet, within that training, there were loud relapses. At Sinai, instead of lingering in the trembling awe that should have followed God's revelation, the people constructed a familiar idol, while Moses delayed on the mountain. Aaron, pressed by fear and the people's voice, fashioned a golden statue. The irony hurts. The very people who had watched God write his law in thunder and smoke resorted to a visible artifact for comfort. The calf episode reveals how quickly a people revert to the tactile when trust is still fragile. Ritual replaced relationship. The desert's lesson had not yet penetrated. There were other failures, violent and grave. At Rephidim, thirsty men quarreled with Moses. Amalek attacked the exhausted. Korah's rebellion later would shatter the camp. Each rupture made the point plain. Outward miracles do not inoculate a people against inward disorder. Leadership, too, was being tested. Moses himself, in his greatest moments, was a man battling his temper and his doubts. He interceded, pleaded, and at times failed in ways that carried real consequences. His poignant exclusion from the Promised Land remains one of the gravest reminders that calling does not remove the cost of disobedience. Leadership in the desert was not glamour. It was heavy, costly, and formative. And then there is Kadesh, an episode that will not let go of the narrative. God commands scouts to spy the land. 10 come back with horror stories, giants in the hills, fortified cities, reports that shrink faith into smallness. 2 return with a different report. Joshua and Caleb testify that, under God's help, the conquest is possible. They see opportunity, not threat. The scene is striking because all of the scouts saw the same repertorial data. Fertile land, clustered vineyards, cities with walls. What changed between the 2 sets of reports was not the evidence. It was the lens through which the evidence was read. This is crucial. Identity shapes interpretation. When your default posture is fear, mountains become mandate. When your default posture is faith, mountains become meat. At this point in the story, the strain becomes theological and deeply personal. God's sentence, 40 years of wandering, a year for each day the spies scouted, reads at first glance like retribution. And it is partly that. There are real consequences for communal unbelief. But there is more at work here than punishment alone. This judgment functions as a multi-layered work of preservation and preparation. The years in the desert kept an immature army from storming into a land it was not yet formed to possess. Consider the psychological picture. Newly freed slaves, trained in dependency, without a history of faith practiced under adversity. Were they ready to govern cities and steward a covenantal nation? The answer, as the narrative unfolds, is no. So God interprets their lack of faith not only as a breach of trust, but as a threat to their sustainability. It would be merciless to give them the land, and see it squandered by a people who had never learned to be a people. This interpretive claim must be stated gently. When I say the desert was necessary, I mean that God's delay contains both justice and mercy. It is corrective, it is also protective. The wilderness becomes a buffer between the immediacy of rescue and the long arc of maturity. Theological reflection can help us name the layers. Identity reprogramming, protection from premature triumph, daily dependence cultivated by manna, a safeguard against the seductive risk of prosperity, and finally, a prophetic pattern. 40 is a biblically significant number associated with testing and transformation. None of these layers diminishes God's holiness or justice. All of them highlight God's pastoral method. Pause and consider an image. A gardener transplanting a sapling. You do not drop the sapling into a garden in full sun and expect its roots to instantly obey. You nurse it, harden it, plant it deep, keep it sheltered from sudden storms. Israel's desert life is like that cultivation. The manna teaches day-by-day dependence. The cloud and the fire teach present, continuous guidance. The preservation of clothing and sandals teaches provision without anxiety about scarcity. Yet the golden calf and the spies teach that provision and presence alone do not guarantee transformed vision. Heart formation is gradual and often painful. Here is a pastoral question for you, the listener. When God brings you through a dramatic deliverance, does your inner story change as quickly as the external circumstance? Do you find yourself, like Israel, walking in the wake of a miracle but living as if the old definitions still hold? In what ways are you still thinking like someone who belonged to Egypt, measuring worth by productivity, safety by control, identity by what you produce rather than by whose you are? These diagnostic questions are not meant to shame, they are meant to illuminate. The wilderness was necessary because it exposes the places where the soul still lives by other masters. At a human level, these years were also the years when God taught the people to live as a community. The camp order around the tabernacle, the Levites' duties, the daily gathering at the tent of meeting. These were the institutions through which a scattered band of former slaves became a nation with a shared memory, ritual, and practice. Community training matters. The desert taught hospitality, interdependence, and ecclesial formation. Without these slow rhythms, the conquest would risk becoming a series of quick victories followed by slow collapses. And yet the story keeps pushing tension. Even as God forms his people, threats loom, leadership cracks, internal rebellions, the temptation to look back toward a life that, while enslaving, felt familiar because it was known. At the summit of Sinai, amid thunder and smoke, law was given that would order a nation. Beneath that mountain, human frailty made a god of gold. The contrast is unnerving. The same people who had tasted daily bread from heaven could also be the first to throw away covenantal fidelity. The desert intensifies extremes, making courage visible and fear exposed. We cannot gloss over Moses in this narrative. He is a figure of towering compassion and tragic limitation. He moves between God and people, pleading for mercy, enforcing God's commands, and carrying the unbearable weight of a stubborn congregation. His final scenes, carrying intercession for a people he will not enter into the land to see, are both heroic and heartbreaking. Moses models the complexity of leadership. God uses flawed humans to enact his purposes. The protection and formation of the nation do not come free of cost. Leaders will pay with their own hopes. Some failures cannot be reversed. Moses' exclusion from the land shows that even the great intercessor is not beyond the consequences of human failing. In the middle of all this, notice Joshua and Caleb, two men whose names will echo as alternative dispositions. They see the same land, the same threats, but their default posture is different. They interpret the signs as opportunities because their identity is anchored in God's promise, not in fear. That difference will prove determinative. The narrative holds them up as prototypes of what the desert is attempting to produce. Leaders who have been trained to trust, who have been honed by dependence, who can lead a people into a new order with courage and vision. Let me press this point home with a modern parallel. Many of you are in seasons that resemble Israel's wilderness. Not all deserts are the same. Some are seasons of waiting for a job. Some are grief that rewires your days. Some are the silence after a ministry disappointment. The temptation is to measure divine favor by speed of arrival. We live in a culture that wants results now. A quick relocation, a rapid restoration, a sudden breakthrough. But consider whether God might, in his wisdom, be doing a surgical work of formation beneath the surface. Are the daily habits of dependence being cultivated in you? Is your identity being reshaped from what I do to whose I am? Before we move on, let us return to the moment after the sea, because it is there that our first early challenge must land. The Red Sea did close behind them, but the path to the Promised Land was not simply geographic. It was moral and spiritual. The wilderness would test whether they would be a people defined by divine promises or by past oppression. The lessons of bitter water, of manna each morning, and of the calf at Sinai all point to one stubborn truth. Liberation without formation leaves a people vulnerable. The desert was painful precisely because God aims to replant identity. If this is resonating with you, if it is bringing clarity to something you've been living through, take a moment and like this teaching and subscribe. There are more reflections coming that will walk this story to its end and bring the practical steps of crossing the Jordan into view. After that first relief and the daily discipline that followed, the narrative tightens its focus toward a defining test. Scouts are chosen. Leaders send spies into a land that is simultaneously promise and provocation. The spies travel. They see vineyards so heavy a single bunch must be carried on a pole between two men. They see fortified cities and people who make them feel small. The imagery is almost cinematic. Clustered grapes like an icon of abundance contrasted with the scouts trembling. The report becomes the lens through which the whole community will interpret its destiny. Here lies the hinge on which 40 years swings. The same land produces two radically different reports. Evidence is neutral. Interpretation is not. The camp holds its breath, and the future waits on the words that will be spoken next. It is at this moment, with the scouts' footsteps still echoing and the camp holding its breath, that the story pauses. The wilderness has sculpted a people who stand at a threshold. The question is no longer whether God can deliver. The question is whether they will receive the new identity being offered. A people who will inherit the land not by clawing for it with the instincts of slaves, but by stepping into it with the habits of trust cultivated across seasons of dependence. The tension is palpable. Will they look back to Egypt or forward to the Jordan? Will fear write the next report, or will faith? And in that pregnant pause, we can see why the desert was necessary. It is not a place of random punishment. It is a slow workshop where a people are formed to be able to inhabit a promise without destroying it. But the story remains fragile. The spies are returning. The camp leans forward. The next words will decide whether the desert's work takes root or falls away. The scouts' footsteps still echoed when the camp shifted toward panic. Some faces turned pale, others clenched teeth. The air held a strange mix of longing for home and dread of the unknown. The 10 scouts described giants, fortified cities, and the weight of walls. They used words that made smallness contagious. We seemed like grasshoppers. Numbers 13. That phrase did more work than physical description. It shrunkened their imagination and made courage impossible. Joshua and Caleb stood apart. Their report was different not because they lied about what they saw, but because they carried a different inner map. They measured the same cluster of grapes and the same ramparts against the memory of God's promise and presence. Where the others measured risk, Joshua and Caleb measured possibility. Their faith did not anesthetize them to danger. It reoriented danger in light of covenantal reality. That contrast matters because it exposes the heart of the matter. The wilderness was trying to rewrite how a people perceived reality. God's response was decisive. The sentence, "That generation would wander for 40 years until a new generation arose," reads as judgment. Numbers 14 tells of a community forfeiting entry because they refused to trust a God who had already shown himself mighty. Yet to reduce the sentence to mere punitive anger is to miss the fuller pastoral logic at work. This is an interpretive insight, not a claim beyond the text. God's verdict simultaneously holds condemnatory and constructive purposes. The sentence removes an unformed people from premature conquest. It protects the nation from a catastrophe they would likely bring upon themselves. It reshapes identity by giving time for new habits, rituals, and memory to take root. Imagine an army of volunteers, fresh from bondage, given the keys to cities and vineyards without a single month of training in governance, law, or covenantal discipline. Such a gift could quickly implode into tyranny, idolatry, and moral collapse. God's delay then functions with layers. It imposes consequence for unbelief, it preserves the land from misgovernance, and it provides the slow schooling necessary for national character. Consider again the image of the manna, not flashy but relentless. Each morning, white flakes on the desert floor invited choice, trust or hoarding. When they chose hoarding, the surplus spoiled. Exodus 16. The desert corrected greed through daily rhythms. Deuteronomy 8 will later frame these years. He humbled you, testing you to know what was in your heart. Deuteronomy 8:2. That ancient text reads like a report card on formation. God wanted to see whether faith would translate into daily dependence, whether the people would trade the daily bread he provided for the illusion of self-sufficiency. Protection also comes into this interpretive reading. The wilderness acts like a buffer. Some forms of haste have lethal consequences. A people that has been spiritually untrained and culturally scarred by slavery is not ready to steward the land's bounty. Prosperity without character becomes a new bondage, an idolatry of abundance that corrodes dependence on God. The golden calf foreshadows that danger. Given freedom and visible resources, the people gravitated toward a tangible object they could control and worship. The desert, by slowing their arrival, reduced the risk that the first taste of plenty would replace relationship with ritual. There is also a prophetic rhythm embedded in 40. Scripture repeatedly uses 40 as a measure of testing and transformation. 40 days of rain in Noah's flood, 40 days of Moses on Sinai, 40 years in the wilderness, 40 days of Jesus' temptation in the wilderness. The number signals a pattern in divine pedagogy. Time as a crucible. It is not arbitrary. It is the narrative's way of indicating, here, something formative is being done. This is another interpretive insight. The number itself is part of the theology. But the wilderness did not simply train the average Israelite. It also revealed and refined leadership. The desert was a pressure cooker that exposed cracks and hardened resolve. Moses, who argued with God and carried a nation in his arms, provides a study in leadership's cost. He interceded repeatedly. He confronted the people's sin. He negotiated with God. Yet Moses also had edges, moments where anger and frustration led to disobedient action. Numbers 20 records one of those moments. At Meribah, Moses strikes the rock instead of speaking to it as God commanded, and God tells him that he will not lead the people into the land. Numbers 20-12. The consequence was personal and painful. Leadership did not grant Moses immunity from accountability. That truth comforts and warns. God raises leaders, but leaders remain subject to divine standards. Their failures bear weight beyond themselves. Aaron too bears the marks of the desert's cost. Pressured by the crowd at Sinai, he fashioned the golden calf. He represented a leadership decision shaped by fear and expediency. The calf episode is not simply about idolatry, it is about the gravitational pull of familiarity when trust is fragile. The desert's work required leaders who would embody courage and fidelity, not capitulation to popular panic. Then there is Korah's rebellion, Numbers 16, a dangerous reminder that formation can breed counterformation. When envy and ambition override humility and submission, communities fracture. Korah's challenge was not merely political, it was theological. Who holds authority and how is it exercised? The earth swallowing of Korah's faction is a dramatic moment that underscores holy order and the necessity of recognizing God's appointed structures. Yet we must interpret such scenes with humility. They reveal that the desert exposes pride and tests motives. They do not endorse violent zealotry as a template for contemporary conflict. The point for us is pastoral. Formation often includes painful purgations that separate genuine devotion from performative rebellion. Life in the desert, sustained by cloud and manna, offered steady, tangible reminders of God's presence. The cloud's daily movement told the camp when to break camp and when to set up. The visible presence made theology ordinary. God's nearness was not a once-off experience, but a lived reality, polemical, practical, and hugely formative. To live under a moving cloud is to learn obedience to presence. You move when God moves. To gather manna is to learn daily dependence. You take only what you need for that day. These rhythms shape the communal imagination and the habits that define a covenant people. Notice, too, the social architecture forming around the tabernacle. The camp was not chaos. It was structured. The tribes had places, standards, and responsibilities. The Levites were given duties that would train them for sacred service. Laws emerged that regulated justice and mercy. These institutions molded character. A people who had once been scattered and subjugated now had practices, rituals, festivals, laws that internalized memory. The desert was sculpting liturgy and identity, not merely testing patience. As the decades passed, new names rose with new habits. Children who had been infants at Babel's exit grew into adults shaped by manna and cloud, not by Egyptian scar tissue. They were the ones who would cross Jordan. Their stories were not marked by the trauma of slavery. They did not know the songs of the brick kilns. Their identity was formed under God's desert curriculum. This is the tragic irony for the older generation. Rescue came too late to recalibrate deeply embedded patterns. Those patterns required time, and in that sense the sentence was both consequence and mercy. Beyond the theological and communal layers, the wilderness also functioned as a moral amplifier. It intensified inclinations. Faith became more visible, fear more conspicuous, obedience clearer, and rebellion brighter. In crisis, character shows. In the litmus test of scarcity, choices reveal motive. The desert's austerity removed distractions and forced decisions. It exposed what people actually trusted, God, or the illusion of control. This is the pastoral edge of the narrative. Hardship refines the heart by removing substitutes and making dependence explicit. Then came the closing scenes. 40 years later, the demography of the camp had changed. Those who remembered Pharaoh's whip, who had tasted the Nile's bitterness, had largely passed. The generation that stood poised to enter Canaan had been shaped by desert discipline. Joshua and Caleb, who had proven stalwart decades before, sustained their faith. Joshua, trained at Moses' side, bore the call forward. Caleb, whose name became associated with courage, claimed the mountain he had seen years earlier. The narrative squeezes hope into this moment. Formation bears fruit. The desert's long curriculum did not fail. It produced a people capable of receiving the promise. The crossing of the Jordan became a theological mirror of the Red Sea. The waters that had marked the boundary of the wilderness now yielded to God's power once again. Joshua 3. This time, however, the people stepped forward not as those who carried Egypt's identity, but as heirs formed for that inheritance. The manna ceased. Joshua 5:12. Ceasing is a theological punctuation. Daily dependence had done its work. The miraculous ration that trained them was no longer needed in the same way. The transition from daily dependence to settled stewardship required a new obedience, to possess and to guard what God had given without becoming enslaved to abundance. The 12 stones set up at the Jordan, Joshua 4, encapsulate the narrative's ethical memory work. Stones are not merely monuments, they are mnemonic devices. They say, remember where God brought you from, remember how you were trained, remember that you did not possess by your own might. They function as a communal catechesis for future generations. When elders said, these stones will tell your children, they were ensuring that memory, transmitted by ritual and story, would sustain identity and prosperity. What do we do with all of this as contemporary believers? What does Israel's wilderness say to your particular desert, whether it is an empty womb, a stalled career, a closed door in ministry, prolonged illness, grief, or bewildering silence from God? First, we must reclaim the thesis without romanticizing pain. The desert was necessary. That sentence functions not to trivialize suffering, but to interpret it as potentially redemptive when God is present and when the heart is open to formation. The desert can be a season of reorientation rather than an abandonment. Ask yourself, where are you still thinking like someone from Egypt? How have patterns learned in bondage shaped your default responses? Fear, hoarding, identity tethered to productivity or approval. What daily disciplines reflect dependence on God rather than self-reliance? The Israelites' curriculum was made up of small, repeatable acts: gathering food, pitching camp where the cloud rested, following the lead of the Lord's presence. In our day, parallel disciplines might include daily prayer that names our dependence, consistent study that rewires imagination, Sabbath practices that resist consumerist productivity, and community rhythms that prevent isolation. Second, consider formation's timeline. The promise may be near in geography, but distant in character. God's timing often gives us a horizon that requires inner renovation before outward reception. That means the soul's progress may lag behind our calendar. Practice patience that is active rather than passive. What does active patience look like? It is not resigned waiting. It is obedient work in small things that prepares us for larger stewardship. It is learning to be content with daily bread while still pressing forward into God's purposes. Third, name the stones you will set up when you cross your Jordan. Memory anchors future obedience. What testimony will you erect as a family, church, or personal habit to remember how God provided and shaped you? Will you write the story and share it with the next generation? Will you establish a public ritual of thanksgiving? Stones can be literal or symbolic: prayer journals, family traditions, testimonies recorded and shared. The act of remembering is formative. It guards against the amnesia that produces idolatry. Fourth, be honest about leadership and accountability. The desert reveals leaders, and leaders will pay costs. If you lead, examine your motives. Are you seeking control or fostering trust? Are you shaping people to dependency or to courage? The story of Moses warns leaders that zeal without humility can wound communities. The story of Joshua and Caleb encourages leaders to anchor vision in covenantal promises rather than popular demand. Leaders should cultivate practices that sustain moral clarity: regular confession, counsel, and a trusted circle that can speak candid truth. Finally, take the step to cross. The desert's purpose is not to linger indefinitely. While formation can take long, it is not meant to be perpetual stagnation. There is a moment when preparation becomes avoidance, and obedience is called. God's invitation is simultaneously patient and urgent. Trust and step into the land He promises. For some, that step is literal: a new job, a reconciliation, a public ministry. For many, it is a posture, a decision to stop living from old identities and to live as children of promise. Joshua's command, "Choose this day whom you will serve," Joshua 24:15, is an ancient imperative that still cuts to the quick. Commitment precedes conquest. You may ask, how will I know when to cross? Look for evidence of formation. Are your habits aligned with trust? Has dependency on God become a genuine way of life? Are you surrounded by a community shaped by the same rhythms? If the answer trends toward yes, the moment to cross is at hand. And if you cross and find difficulty, remember that God's presence continues. Crossing is not a leap into abandonment, but a step under promise accompanied by covenant care. Let me pause with some diagnostic questions you can journal or pray through. What of your past are you still carrying into the present? What small daily practices reveal your true trust? Who are the Joshua and Caleb figures in your life? People whose vision of you is shaped by God, not by your past scars. What stone will you set up to remember God's work once the next season turns? There will be resistance to this biblical reading. Some may insist the desert is only punishment. Others will demand instant exit strategies. Both miss the subtler pastoral truth. Formation often includes consequence. Mercy and discipline are not mutually exclusive. The biblical God is both just and gracious, and the wilderness narrative holds both truths in tension. We should also guard against two modern misreadings: triumphalism that equates faith with guaranteed material success, and a fatalism that treats deserts as meaningless suffering. The Exodus story offers neither. It affirms that miracles happen, that God provides daily sustenance, and that presence accompanies pain. Yet it also shows that habits and hearts matter. Prosperity without character leads to idolatry. Deliverance without reformation leaves people vulnerable. Imagine finally the riverbank scene where 12 stones stand sentinel. Children gather stones of their own to hear elders tell a remembered story. How God brought their people through humiliation into inheritance. How daily bread built a people. How obedience, however costly, shaped a nation capable of keeping a land. That is the pastoral vision we are invited into, a community marked by memory, formed by habits, and summoned to courage. So let me challenge you now with what I hope you hear as grace. If you are in a desert, do not interpret it only as abandonment. It might be a workshop where God is teaching you to be a steward, not merely a survivor. Cultivate the daily disciplines that teach dependence. Surround yourself with people who will resist the temptation to promise quick fixes and instead help you build character. Name the stones. Publicize the testimony, so your future children will know what God did. And when the time comes to cross, step forward with Joshua and Caleb's vision, trusting that the same God who fed you in the wilderness will go before you into the land. If this has spoken to you, share it with someone who is in a season of waiting, and subscribe for more teaching that walks these biblical stories into practical life. Lord, we thank you for the clarity of your ways even when they pass through deserts we did not choose. Speak to our hardened places, soften the habits of fear and hurry. Teach us day by day to depend on your provision. Give courage to those who must cross. Give patience to those who must prepare. May the stones we set up testify to your faithfulness, and may we never forget that grace shapes us through both deliverance and discipline. Amen.